On February 17, 2025, a Delta Airlines flight from Minneapolis crashed while attempting to land at Toronto Pearson International Airport. Here's a breakdown of what happened leading up to the crash and everything we know so far. Delta Flight 4819, operated by Endeavour Air, was en route from Minneapolis to Toronto Pearson International Airport. The aircraft involved was a Bombardier CRJ-900, a regional jet commonly used for shorter flights. According to FAA records, the CRJ-900 was about 16 years old at the time of the incident. The flight carried 80 people, including 4 crew members and 76 passengers. The region had been dealing with drifting snow after being affected by 2 snowstorms in the past few days. At the time, the airport was also experiencing challenging weather conditions. Winds were blowing at 32 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 40, though no significant crosswinds were reported. Despite the winter weather, the runway condition was reported as a 5 on a scale from 1 to 6, just 1 level below dry, indicating good braking action.
Toronto Tower, Endeavour 4819, contact, Island 23.
Endeavour 4819, Toronto Tower, wind 270-23, gust 33, clear to line on rate 23, you might get a slight bump in the glide path, there'll be an aircraft in front of it.
Clear to land 23, Endeavour 4819.
Shortly after 2 p.m. local time, Flight 4819 began its final approach to Toronto Pearson. Air traffic control cleared the plane to land on runway 23, but warned the pilots of a possible side bump on the glide path. ATC reported that the wind was coming from 270 degrees at 23 knots, with gusts reaching up to 33. The approach was stable, and the pilots reported no issues during the descent. While the crew carefully managed the descent, unexpected problems arose in the final moments. The plane suddenly struck the runway much harder than anticipated, resulting in a loss of control. It touched down with its right main landing gear first, followed by the right wing making contact with the runway. Upon hitting the tarmac, the plane veered off course and, unable to regain control, flipped over. In seconds, the situation went from a routine landing attempt to a crash. The aircraft came to a stop upside down. The force of the impact caused significant damage, including the detachment of the tail and one of its wings. Inside the cabin, passengers suddenly found themselves hanging upside down. Panic erupted as they rushed to unbuckle their seatbelts and escape. First responders quickly arrived at the scene, assisting passengers out of their seats and guiding them to safety. Despite the chaos, all 80 people on board survived the crash, with 18 people sustaining injuries. Fortunately, none of the injuries were life-threatening, thanks to the swift response of the flight crew and emergency services, as well as the robust design of the CRJ-900. While the cause of the crash is still under investigation, weather conditions on the day of the incident may have played a role. Investigators are also looking into whether the aircraft may have had a history of technical issues. Both Canadian and US authorities are involved in the investigation, with the Transportation Safety Board of Canada leading the efforts, assisted by the US National Transportation Safety Board. This crash is the latest in a series of air travel incidents in recent months. Less than 3 weeks ago, a mid-air collision in Washington between an American Airlines plane and a US Army Black Hawk helicopter resulted in 67 fatalities. Here's what happened, based on the first NTSB preliminary report. On January the 29th, 2025, PSA Airlines Flight 5342 was on its final approach to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. The aircraft had taken off from Wichita earlier that evening, carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members. 2 experienced pilots were at the controls. The captain had been with PSA Airlines for nearly 6 years, and the first officer had been with the airline for almost 2 years. The flight had been routine up to this point, and the weather conditions had been favorable. While the pilots were preparing to land, a US Army Black Hawk helicopter, call sign PAT-25, was on a night training mission a few miles away. The Black Hawk, which had 3 crew members on board, was part of an annual evaluation exercise. The flight focused on training military pilots for low-altitude maneuvers over the Potomac River, a mission requiring precision, coordination, and strict adherence to assigned altitudes. The pilots had been instructed to stay at or below 200 feet while following Route 1 before transitioning to Route 4. This well-known helicopter corridor near Reagan National Airport intersects multiple approach and departure routes, requiring precise coordination with air traffic control. The management of this complex airspace was the responsibility of the air traffic controllers at Reagan National, who were tasked with coordinating both planes and helicopters. However, Reagan National had been dealing with a controller shortage for years. On this particular night, only one controller was responsible for managing both plane and helicopter traffic. Typically, these roles were handled separately during peak hours, but they had been consolidated earlier than usual that night. The controller on duty that evening cleared Flight 5342 to land on runway 1. However, as the aircraft approached, the controller reassigned it to runway 33. This required the pilots to execute a sidestep maneuver to align with the shorter runway. In doing so, they would descend over the Potomac River and cross the path of the Black Hawk.
Tower 5342 on Mount Vernon visual, runway 1.
Pushing 5342, Washington Tower 1 star 320 17, got 25, can you take runway 33?
Yeah, we can do 33 for Blue 5342.
Pushing 5342, that's a Wilson Bridge, change to turn for runway 33, clear to land.
Change to runway 33, runway 33 for land, Blue 5342.
Meanwhile, the Black Hawk continued its training flight, following the Potomac River. As it approached the airport, the air traffic controller asked the crew if they had the CRJ in sight. The crew confirmed visual contact and requested visual separation, meaning they would ensure safe spacing. The controller approved.
Pass 25, traffic just off the Wilson Bridge and CRJ at 1,200 feet, start runway 33.
Scott has a traffic inside, request visual separation.
Good separation, crew.
According to the NTSB, the helicopter's cockpit voice recorder suggests that the word "circling" may not have been received, potentially leading the crew to focus on a different aircraft or fail to anticipate the plane approaching from the side. In the meantime, the pilots of Flight 5342 had begun their landing sequence, making a slight right turn before the final left turn to align with runway 33. At this point, a series of events may have led to the plane's misidentification. The NTSB is still investigating the matter, but several factors could have contributed to the confusion. Both helicopter pilots likely wore night vision goggles designed to enhance low-light visibility. However, these goggles restricted peripheral vision and made depth perception more complex, potentially making it harder to judge distances accurately. The challenge of spotting the plane was further compounded by the city lights behind the approach path of runway 33, which blended in with the incoming aircraft. Additionally, while the landing lights were on, they were forward-facing, making them less visible from the side, where the Black Hawk was flying. As the plane and the Black Hawk were closing in on each other, the conflict alert warning was activated in the tower. The controller responded and asked the helicopter crew to confirm whether they had a visual of the approaching CRJ.
Pass 25, get the CRJ in sight. Pass 25, pass behind the CRJ.
Pass 5 has a aircraft inside, request visual separation.
Good separation.
The words "pass behind" may not have heard by the crew, possibly due to the helicopter's microphone key being depressed at that moment. Flight 5342 continued its descent, executing the required steep left turn for landing. Meanwhile, the Black Hawk was flying at approximately 325 feet, exceeding the maximum assigned altitude for Route 4. This discrepancy could have been due to the Black Hawk's altimeter being inaccurate, according to the NTSB. The cockpit crew received a traffic advisory warning about the impending collision. Typically, below 500 feet, many TCAS systems do not issue oral traffic warnings, but in this case, one was triggered.
Traffic.
The crew attempted to prevent a collision, but it was already too late. Seconds later, at 8:48, the two collided. The collision shattered the Black Hawk mid-air, sending flaming debris into the Potomac River. The jet suffered severe damage, lost control, and plunged into the river just half a mile from the runway threshold. Minutes after the incident was reported, emergency responders from Washington, D.C., Arlington County, Maryland State Police, and the U.S. Coast Guard arrived at the crash site. All 67 lives were lost in the crash. The collision was the deadliest U.S. aviation disaster in 16 years. A man walks home after a long day at work. Above him, the distant roar of an aircraft grows louder. It sounds different, heavier, closer than usual. He slows down and looks up. A Boeing 747, clearly in serious danger.
Hello, 1862, mayday, we have an emergency.